Welcome back, everyone, to Short Splats. I'm Jared, brought to you from Halloween Haunts 365. Today, as you can tell from this thumbnail here, we're going to talk about horror video games. I grew up playing them. I can't say that I play them that much anymore. More into Call of Duty and sports, but they're still coming in pretty heavy. There's a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the works for the new gen systems and PC. I might have to check that out. We'll see. Well, let's get into this. I got a brief history of horror video games for us. Also, don't forget, we have the Friday the 13th Minicon in Blairstown, New Jersey. Let's hear from Jimmy about that.
Save the date! Friday the 13th, May 2022, the only Friday the 13th of the year. Yours truly, Jimmy J, and the Horror 365 team are coming back to Blairstown. And for what? The first ever Friday the 13th Minicon, all hosted by the Blairstown Diner. Guys, girls, horrorheads, tickets are on sale next Thursday, January 13th. Stay tuned. More announcements are coming your way for another killer time in Blairstown. We'll see you there.
Alright, Jimmy J, for the Friday the 13th Minicon, Blairstown, New Jersey. Make sure you get your tickets now. It'll be in the description later, so make sure you click, buy those ticks. Ha, that rhymed. Alright, let's pop into the horror. The incorporation of general horror genre themes into video games came early on in the medium, inspired by horror fiction and especially horror films. The earliest rudimentary attempt at a horror video game dates back to as early as 1972, when a haunted house overlay was included with the first video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. Inspired by haunted house fiction, Tato's classic arcade game, video game Space Invaders, has also been cited to be the precursor to horror video games. That's more sci-fi to me. I don't get that. As it involved a survival scenario where an alien invasion slowly descends and increasingly destroys the landscape, while menacing sound effects gradually speed up, which created a sense of panic for the players. The text-based game Mystery House in 1980 and Lurking Horror in 1987 incorporated horror elements through their textual descriptions of rooms. Assis Corporation's Nostromo in 1981 for the PC 6001, inspired by the science fiction horror Alien, was a survival horror game that involved escaping from an invisible alien with limited available resources. Another notable early horror video game was Haunted House in 1982 for the Atari 2600. At that point, video game technology lacked the fidelity to carry the themes of horror in the technology and was instead wrapped more in game manuals and other presentation manuals. 3D Monster Maze in 1982 for the Sinclair ZX81, while not containing images tied with horror games, was one of the first games to introduce the feeling of suspense and mystery typically associated with the genre. With more graphical compatibility and capabilities, games should start to include horror-related imagery often present in the licensed game based on horror films in the 80s and 90s, such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 83, Halloween in 83, Friday the 13th in 89, as well as games inspired by horror films such as the survival horror Project Firestart in 89, which was inspired by Alien. Due to limitations of consoles and computers at the time, these horror images were often limited due to cutscenes rather than animated sprites using the action-based gameplay as to give the fidelity to the details of the horror scene. Sega's Monster Bash 1982 was a horror-themed arcade action game that depicted the classic movie monsters such as Dracula, Frankenstein, and werewolves. Other horror-themed action games that followed in the late 1980s included Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins, that was a fun game, I don't know if it was a horror, Konami's Castlevania, and Sega's Ghost House in 1986, with more violent, gory arcade horror games including Chiller, Splatterhouse, and one of the best known haunted house themed graphic adventure game was Maniac Mansion. Sweet Home was a survival horror role playing video game based on the Japanese horror film of the same name. It was Capcom's first survival horror title, directed by Takuro Fujiwara, there we go, who had earlier designed Ghosts and Goblins and later went on to produce Resident Evil, which was originally intended to be a remake of Sweet Home. Phantasmagoria by Rebecca Williams was one of the earliest psychological horror games. Alone in the Dark, developed by Infogrames and inspired by H.P. Lovecraft fiction and George Romero zombie films, was one of the first survival horror games to bring a more immersive presentation, including crude 3D figures drawn atop the 2D rendered background, so the players would control their character from a fixed camera angle. This allowed the developers to create the necessary tension throughout the game. Alone in the Dark was a global success on personal computers, and I believe it was also out for PlayStation 1. Dark went on to inspire Capcom's original Resident Evil in '96, which coined the survival horror term. It spawned the Resident Evil franchise, which defined and popularized survival horror games. Sega's The House of the Dead was an arcade horror shooter game that introduced fast zombies who could run, jump, and swim, whereas Konami's Silent Hill defined and popularized psychological horror games. While horror games were inspired by horror films up until the 1990s, horror games were later influencing horror films by the 2000s. The success of Resident Evil and The House of the Dead sparked a renewed interest in zombie films by the 2000s, influencing hit zombie films such as 28 Days Later, the Resident Evil film series, Dawn of the Dead, and one of my favorites, Shaun of the Dead. The Resident Evil and House of the Dead games influenced zombie films to move towards a more action-oriented approach with scientific themes and fast-running zombies. Horror games also benefited from the indie game growth in the 2010s, since outside of established franchises like Resident Evil, major publishers had shied away from the genre. Series like Frictional Games' Nubra series and Amnesia series, and Red Barrel's Outlast series captured the type of gameplay from horror games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil. Slender, the 8 Pages, took advantage of the popular Slender Man creepypasta and became one of the first games to gain popularity from viewers watching reactions to online streamers playing the game, Twitch. The Five Nights at Freddy's series by Scott Cawthon also similarly captured popularity through watching streamers' reactions to jump scares. More recently, in the early 2020s, indie horror games have found a new aesthetic based on emulating the graphic style of older platforms, such as the low graphics of the first Sony PlayStation console, or even pixel art. Rather than high realism from the modern 3D graphics, besides capturing a sense of nostalgia, developers are also able to use retro-inspired graphics on modern hardware to continue to manipulate the player and surprise them beyond the expectations of the visuals, such as giving the player the idea that the game itself is cursed and potentially breaking the fourth wall. So, that's a little tidbit. Horror video games goes much deeper than that, but like I said, these are little short splats. We're not going to dive too deep into it, but horror video games have been there since video games have come out. And we have a guest. Horror video games have always been around. They're fun. Some can be scary. Friday the 13th used to scare the living shit out of me because you didn't know what cabin Jason was in, what stupid room tilt he was in, and all of a sudden, da-da-da! Ugh. Crazy. Alright, but let me get into my top 5 horror games of all time. Like I said, these are old because I haven't played in a while. I haven't really dove into horror games. I'm a Call of Duty guy. I'm a Madden guy. I'm a golf game guy. I like just constantly moving. The horror games, the single players, maybe I'll look at them again. My kid gets really into them. So, we'll see. But, number 5 for me, and here's a little playthrough, Castlevania NES. Pretty cool stuff. Pretty cool stuff out of Castlevania. That was from the original Nintendo Entertainment Center. That's my 5th favorite horror. So going to my 4th favorite horror, here's House of the Dead. No, I'm sorry. Nightmare on Elm Street from NES. Why is it so low on my list? Because of the what game? Your typical licensed side scroller. I mean, I will do a short spot about that and Friday the 13th because they were so instrumental to me growing up and being a huge horror fan. So I'm going to continue on with the next one, which was Resident Evil from PlayStation 1. Let's take a look at some footage. Man, I remember when that was some top of the line graphics and we'd never seen anything like it. Now, it's so boring to watch, and I really don't want to play Resident Evil again. I don't really want to play Nightmare either, that bore fest. Alright, so moving on. Number 2 for me was an arcade game that I played a lot. It was House of the Dead. And also, don't mind any ads or anything you see in here. I just pulled them off YouTube as, examples of what the game looked like. I'm not trying to make money off it or anything. So, here we go. Alright, who remembers arcade games? I mean, they used to be awesome, getting the $5 whole from your parents and getting the whole stack of quarters and running down there and playing some great games. I mean, the graphics were a lot better in the arcades up until about, I'm going to say PlayStation. PlayStation and, Sega Genesis with Mortal Kombat kind of took a turn. Because it kind of looked like the arcade. The arcade just moved faster. The frames per second were faster. But I think PlayStation finally ended the arcades. And then PS2 was just the best system ever. And now I'm an Xbox guy. So, who knows? My number 1 all-time, and this is even one of my all-time favorite games ever, regardless of genre, is Friday the 13th for NES. Let's get to it. Brings back memories. Mark and Christy were the best characters on there because they could jump so freaking high and they were so fast. And you were always going the wrong way on the map, and it was a cool game. Really cool game. It didn't need to have high graphics. It's one I never beat, so maybe I'll get an emulator. I do have an NES controller for here, so maybe we'll do a walkthrough on Twitch or something. I think that'd be fun. So those are my 5 favorite horror games. That was a brief look into horror video games as a whole. We have a lot more coming. So make sure you subscribe. It'll be down here, over here. Just a lot more horror stuff, haunt stuff, gaming. Huge gamer, and maybe we'll start getting into some horror. But that's a brief history into horror video games. They've been around just as long as video games. That's all I got for you. I'm Jerry from Halloween Haunt 365, and I am out.